Welcome back. In today's lesson, we're going to be talking about property binding. Now, JavaFX allows us to use property binding to bind a target object to a source object. Therefore, if the value of the source object changes, the target object's value is changed automatically. The target object is called a binding object, or the binding property, and the source object is called the bindable object, or the observable object. As we discussed in the previous lesson, the circle that we have right here, or we can prove this if we run the program, the circle we have in this case is not centered. This means that initially it's of course going to be centered because that's how we created it. However, if you were to change the size of this window, the circle stays where it is. Now the circle is far from being centered. And if we change the height of the window, then the circle still remains where it used to be and therefore is no longer centered. And if we shrink the size of the window, the circle again is no longer centered. So the way to fix this is to bind the center of the x value and the center y value to the height and width of the pane. The way to do this is using property binding. So to do this, we're going to say we first need to make sure we created our pane up here. Previously, we created our pane right here. We need to now create it before we create the stage. You'll see why in a little bit. So now that we've made sure our pane is in the correct position, we can now get started. Instead of saying set center x and set center y, we're actually going to change this. This is because saying set enter x and set center y implies that you want to set the property once. We want to set the property multiple times, because every time the value of the window changes, we need to change the value of the x and y values of the center. So to do that, we're going to change this from set center x to center x property. Then we're going to have a method call, and we can get rid of this. And then we're going to say dot bind. After we've binded, we want to say pane1 in this case, because we created the pane1 object right here. We want to say pane1 dot width property dot divide, and then we want to divide by 2. So what this says is that you want to have the center x property. We'll get more into what this means, but what this just says in a very basic way is just like the getChildren method that we have, which we used up here. The center x property allows it returns a list. Then we say dot bind, which means we want to attach this value to the value of something else. And the way this notation will work is you would have target object, source object. So it's target object dot bind source object. In our case, the source object is going to be pane1, which we created up here, dot width property, which tells us the height and width of the window itself, because that's the width property we're working with here. And then we want to divide that by 2. This gives us a center, since if you took the length of something, divided it by 2, then you get the center of that line. In the same way, we want to actually copy paste this for the y property. So to do that, we're just going to actually copy paste this entire thing, and the only thing we're going to be changing is instead of saying set, and we previously said set center y, we're just going to change that to center y. Therefore, now the circle's y property will also, and if we change this from width property to height property, will now just be bound to the appropriate length or width, in this case, of the window we're working with. So if we run the program now, you can see the difference. So let's try this out. Now if we look at our blue circle, initially it's still going to be in the center. However, now if we resize the window, you'll notice the circle still stays in the center. This is in spite of the fact that even if we change the, if we just increase it horizontally, if we increase it just vertically, or if we do both, the circle will always stay in the center, but it stays at the same size. This is because if we look back at our code, you can see this when we said set radius 50. You could bind the radius, however, you want the circle size to stay the same, unless you wanted the circle to take up a certain percentage of your of the Windows area, in which case you would bind it then. However, in our case, we want the size of the circle to remain the same, but now, because we bound it, it'll now just change the location depending on the distance, that the length and the distance of the height of your window. Now it's important to note that you actually don't need to specify pane1.width property.divide by 2. You can actually just say width and height divide by 2. However, this tends to run into a couple of issues if you're working with multiple panes, so in our case we're not going to use that. You might be wondering how this works. The way this property works is that whenever you change the value of the height or width, it returns a value back to the Java virtual machine. The Java virtual machine, because it has these bind methods, knows that if the value is changed, it should alert the center X and center Y properties. Then it should change them based on what the value is, how the height or width was changed. So you can actually, that's how it works in the back end, because every time you modify the value of the height or width, the result is just sent back to the Java virtual machine, which then notifies the appropriate method call, in this case, these two lines. Now the bind method is defined in the JavaFX.beans.property.property interface. This interface is by default implemented and imported with every JavaFX application, so we don't need to implement it. That's why we don't need to implement it in our queue when we run the program. That's why we don't have to say implements, because it's auto-loaded. The source object and the bind method are going to be instances of this interface, but the source object, interestingly, is also an instance of the JavaFX.beans.value observable value interface. The observable value is an entity that wraps a value and allows the value to look for changes. Now you might have noticed how this sounds very similar to the observable list that we get when we say get children. In fact, it is, because both of these return a value, and both of those values can then be modified. So JavaFX defines binding properties for all primitive types and strings. For a double, float, long, integer, or boolean value, the binding property type is a double property, float property, long property, integer property, boolean property, and for a string, its type is a string property. These properties are all subtypes of the observable value. This means they can all be used as source objects for binding properties. For example, if you had to, let's say you wanted to make sure that every single time you modified the value of D1, you wanted to change the value of D2. The way to do this would be, first you'd have to import a double property, but all you'd have to do is say D1.bind D2, so that every time D1 was changed, D2 would be changed correspondingly. In addition, we should probably talk about the conventions and a little bit of terminology. So each binding property, such as the center X and center X property, in a JavaFX class, in this case the circle class that we're working with, has a getter, get center X property, or get center X, and a setter, set center X with a double value, and set center X property, the method for returning and setting the property's value. This is a very important distinction. The get center X property and the get center X are different because one of them is returning a property object, whereas the other one is just returning a value. So let's expand into this. If you had the get center X method, this method is a value getter method, and the set center X method is a value setter method. However, on the other hand, the center X property is a property getter method, and the center Y property that we've used here is also a property getter method. It's important to note that the get center X method, which is a value getter method, returns a double value, and the center X property returns a object of the double property type, as I mentioned. This is because these are going to work similarly. If you use the normal value getter method and you got a long, then the property returning method would give you a long property type. The convention for defining a property in a class is very simple. All it does is it says what is the type, data type we're working with, a primitive data type or string, and then just convert that to a property and return that. This is important to note, since if you're trying to use your get method somehow, and we're trying to kind of cut down the amount of code, it's important to note whether you're going to be returning a double property object or a value object, because this radically changes the way your program works, since one of them is an object type, one of them is a primitive data type. Now, before we end this lesson, I'd like to give a quick keynote about why you might think that these are synchronous, or they work both ways. It's important to note that when we say center x property dot bind and then we provide a value, this is one way. This is called undirectional binding. This means that it only works so that when the property, when the height and width change of the window, then the x property will be changed. If the x property is changed, the height and width of the window won't correspondingly be changed. In addition, if you wanted it to work this way, you would have to use bidirectional binding. To use bidirectional binding, you have to have an appropriate type. In this case, we can't have an appropriate type, since if the user can resize something, you don't want to override the user's ability to resize the window. Since if the user resizes the window, and if you use bidirectional binding, meaning the change in one value would change the other value, so if you change the x value, you would also change the value of the window. If you did that, then every single time the user changed the size of the window, then the x value would change correspondingly, and you'd have an infinite loop. So you have to make sure if you do use bidirectional binding, it's a lot more specific, and you have to make sure you have two objects of the appropriate type. So hopefully you found this lesson useful. To summarize, in today's lesson, we talked about property binding. We talked about how property binding allows us to have a source object that's tied to a target object tied to a source object, so that if the value in the source object changes, the target object is changed automatically. We talked about the syntax for creating a binded object. We talked about how it's always target.bind and then in parentheses your source. We talked about how the binding method works and the difference between a value getter method and a property getter method. And then we talked about bidirectional binding and how you can use binding with primitive data types. Hopefully you found this lesson useful, and hopefully you're able to leverage binding in your own code and in your own JavaFX programs, since it really makes them more powerful and allows you to better respond to user inputs.